Hello, Jane Fonda.
Hello, you.
So there is this documentary, Jane Fonda in 5 acts, a really honest documentary. Susan Lacey directed.
The creator of American Masters.
Right. So she knows what she's doing.
Yeah.
This is your whole life. It's soup to nuts.
So far.
Jane, the whole life so far.
Jane Fonda.
One of Hollywood's most exciting new stars.
There's a lot of hostility towards you.
Would you have done anything differently?
This is the beginning of my last act. In order to know how to go forward, I'm going to have to know where I've been. It took me a really long time to find my own narrative. But, I am what I am.
Why did you want to do this right now?
Because she asked me. You know, the fact is, I've had a really interesting life, and people ask me all the time to do documentaries. And then Susan asked, and I really admire Susan and the work she did on American Masters. And I said to her, well, I don't want you to do a documentary about a movie star, because I'm more than that. That's just a part of who I am. And I knew that she got that. And since you've seen the documentary, you know that she didn't do the usual thing.
I was so in from the very second it starts.
Well,
because
starts
it
so
starts with tape.
And that totally took me by surprise.
Yo, you didn't know she was going to do that?
No, I didn't know anything about it.
It's a recording of Richard Nixon talking about
whatever
Jane Fonda.
happened to Jane Fonda.
Yeah.
Poor
He was
Henry.
perplexed.
Well, Nixon wasn't perplexed. Nixon was furious.
Yeah.
According to the secret tapes that are now in Maryland in the files, he spent more time kvetching about me and trying to, get me for treason than he did Brezhnev. According to insiders, said that.
How threatened did you feel when you heard? Because the anti-Jane Fonda, we have to stop her. We're going to, find her guilty of treason. It went all the way to the top of it. It went all the way to the Nixon White House.
Yeah.
At what point did you say, I'm not going to let that stop me. In fact, I'm going to speak more loudly than I have even before?
It's just my nature, If I know that what I'm doing is right, even though I certainly made mistakes, it made me more determined to keep going and for them not to stop me. Keep going means I'm not going to stop talking about what's wrong with the Vietnam War, and then later the corporate control of our economy and other things that I speak out about. Just trying to do it better, to learn more and go deeper.
What did you want to say with the documentary?
Well, one thing is the value of being an activist. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. The fact that I went in 100% with all of my being and survived. Now, of course, I'm white and I'm privileged and I'm famous, so that has to be taken into consideration. But the activism saved me.
I'm here to talk about people whose lives are at stake. I am white, and I am a movie actress. I risk much less. The jails of this country are overflowing with people whose only crime is to be black and free and spreading the word around to free other people. And this is something that everyone has to become very aware of.
And so I think I want people to take away a sense of the importance of activism, to give you ballast and a core and meaning, the importance of always trying to get better and going deeper and becoming a better person. I always knew in the midst of the father and then the 3 marriages, which make up the 4 acts, that if I stop here, I'm only going to be half a person. There's more that I have to try to achieve and get to, not in terms of career, but just as growth as a human being.
It was interesting, given the fact that so much of your story and what you are proud of at this point in your life is that you are not defined by a man in your life, that you know your own heart, you know your own moral compass, you worked hard to find those things.
It didn't just happen.
No, it was a lot of work and a lot of pain. But I found it so interesting and honest that the documentary is Jane Fonda in 5 acts. 4 of those acts are the men in your life. It's Henry Fonda and then your 3 husbands. What kind of discussions went into structuring it that way and calling it that?
We didn't discuss it at all. I had no idea what she was going to do with the voluminous amount of interviews she did with me, because unlike most documentaries, it's mostly me talking and incredible archival footage with very few other people, most notably my son. I didn't know what she was going to do. It took me completely by surprise that she did it the way she did in 5 acts, and I completely understand why. As I talk about in my book, up until my 60s, I was, to a large extent, defined by the men in my life. You know, I was brought up to please. I wanted my father to love me, and so I would turn myself into a pretzel to be what he wanted me to be. And it just took me a long time to get over it. You know, we're born, and usually we don't get to choose our parents. And so there are issues, and there are wounds, and there are handicaps, and you spend the rest of your life trying to get over them. And it took me into my 60s. And then I began to become who I was supposed to be all along.
In the documentary, as you do also in your memoir, you talk about one particular photo. It was a family photo, sort of a stage picnic at your house in Greenwich when you were a little girl. And it is you and your brother, your stepsister, your father, and your mother. But that photo says so much to you and about you. And part of that is your mother and the look on her face of real stress. What does that photo say to you about your family?
My family was falling apart. My mother at that time was in and out of mental institutions. And my father was seeing another woman, just a little bit older than me, 7 years older than me. And he was there because he felt an obligation to come home he was doing Mr. Roberts, but he would come home on Sunday when he didn't have any performances, but he wasn't really there. And you can see in the photograph, you know, I'm looking at him and he's looking away, and I can just see where he is. He's with her.
Did you know about the affair at the time?
No.
You just sensed he was somewhere else. Yeah.
And my mother is in the background looking sort of stricken, and it just makes me so sad.
So much of this documentary and your book as well, and we sort of saw it happen on screen and on Golden Pond many, many years later, but a lot of this story in the documentary is about forgiveness and the huge Herculean effort that it takes to understand and forgive parents. And you had a particularly traumatic upbringing with both parents. When did you decide, I need to understand them and I need to forgive them?
When I wrote my memoir, I dedicated it to my mother, who killed herself when I was 12, because I knew that if I did dedicate it to her, rather than sweep her under the rug, I would be forced to really try to figure her out. I never really knew her because she suffered from, well, they called it manic depression in those days. Now we say bipolarity.
And you actually you got her medical records.
I got her medical records. And so writing my memoir, which took me 5 years, which I later discovered psychologists called doing a life review, and they advocated for people who are suffering from depression or just older. What it does when you go back and review your life, but really dig in, not just then I did this and then I did that, but really, who were my parents? And it necessitates sometimes getting those photographs and literally looking at them with a magnifying glass and trying to understand what they mean. And then who were their parents, your grandparents? Why were they the way they were? How did they raise my parents? And when you can, through that kind of research, it's almost like being an archaeologist, if you can come to answers, which I was able to do, you end up being able to say, it had nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
It wasn't that I wasn't lovable. They had issues. And the minute you know that, you can feel tremendous empathy for them, and you can forgive. And you asked me in the beginning what I would like people to take away. The importance of forgiveness is one of the things.
Your son, Troy Garrity, is interviewed in the documentary.
Yeah.
And he says that he believes your relationship with your mother was the defining relationship, or her suicide was the defining moment. And I was surprised to hear that in a way, because I know so much about you and your father and about that journey. But do you agree with Troy that maybe was the incident of the relationship that had the biggest impact?
It's certainly had a big impact, but it's not just the actual act of suicide, it's what led up to it. Mm-hmm. Because, if you have a parent who is not capable of showing up, not capable of reflecting you back through eyes of love, mm-hmm. it has a big impact on your sense of self. And as a child, you always think it was your fault, because right. A child can't blame the adult. They depend upon adults for survival. And so it takes a long time to get over the guilt.
It's also very difficult for people who come from fractured homes or homes with trauma and abuse to know themselves and then make the right choices in relationships. And the people that I know who have, it took me until 50 to figure out to make the right choice and then behave correctly in a relationship, right? That's something that a lot of people don't realize, that if you come from that kind of background, a background that's fractured, a background that didn't teach you to love yourself and give you your own sense of self, that there needs to be a lot of work done really before you get into relationships. Otherwise, we learn on the job.
Which is not always successful.
It makes it difficult.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think happens is you tend to be attracted to people, and not consciously at all.
Right.
I was certain that in each case of my 3 husbands, that I was moving towards a man who was the polar opposite of my father. Mm-hmm. Superficially, but deep down, they were all men. And I love them and admire all of them. And they were wonderful men, and I don't regret it at all. But they were not able to show up themselves for addictions and all kinds of reasons. And, I sometimes wonder if the really perfect relationship for me came my way and I ran away terrified because I didn't want to be with someone that said, come on, Fonda, show up.
Yeah. Or
because I couldn't show up either.
Right. You seem to sense, you find the person who's going to allow you to recreate those, as unpleasant as it might be, but to recreate the relationships you had as a child with your family.
Yeah, yeah.
Not always good.
Yeah. I think that's why I'm by myself now. I just wasn't dealt a relational deck of cards.
But you're so different now. Do you? I mean, you know so much about yourself, and do you date now? You don't.
I've closed up shop.
Is that what you say to people when they ask you out? Because
they don't ask me
sure.
out.
I bet they do.
No.
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 Probably because you say in interviews that you've closed up shop. So the second act of the documentary is Roger Vadim.
Yeah.
Why did you fall in love with him?
Oh, everyone fell in love with Roger Vadim, men and women. Jack Valetti, the head of the Motion Picture Academy, got to know Vadim, and every time I would see him, he would say, I never in my life met a more charming man. He was the most, well, he was handsome, he was incredibly sexy, and he could charm anyone. I mean, before me, it was Brigitte Bardot, Catherine Deneuve, Annette Streuberg, and so forth. And I was young, and I wanted him to teach me how to be a woman.
One of the...
So he taught me to be a female impersonator.
I was just getting to that. So we were just talking before we started rolling that Barbarella is going to be showing at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery.
Right.
It has become this sort of, it has become a camp classic in the years, and you have sort of come to love that movie.
Yeah.
As crazy and silly as it is. What do you love about it?
It's just so fanciful. And it's almost feminist. I mean, after all, she runs her own spacecraft. She is asked by the President of the United States to fly to this planet and bring back the evil scientist that's been captured. You know, she's given a lot of responsibility. I got him. You know, when it first came out, I was just becoming an activist and a feminist, and
Right.
and I thought it wasn't politically correct, and now I appreciate it because it's not.
It was a funny movie to have out there when you became an
Right.
activist and
Yeah,
a feminist,
yeah.
and you got a lot of blowback for it.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
sure.
sometimes if I was speaking like in a theater at a rally, the marquee would say, "Come see Barbarella speak."
That seems like an odd thing. I mean, that's a little bit hostile.
You think?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yes.
A little bit. The making of, I just want to ask you quickly about the making of Barbarella, which actually sounds like the most torturous filmmaking experience almost any actress has ever had.
You know, I didn't like to get naked, and so the opening sequence where I have to get naked, and Vadim promised me that the titles would cover everything that needed to be covered. He lied. But so I just got raging drunk on vodka. And it turned out we had to do it a second time because a bat had flown between the camera and me, so we had to do it the next day. So I was hungover.
And drunk again.
And drunk again.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's the only way it could be done.
Yeah.
After the relationship with Vadim ended, and you did the film Clute,
Yeah.
you said something really interesting about that in the documentary, which is that you actually found your voice. Like a lot of women, because you thought this was what you were supposed to do, you had been speaking in film and in life, I assume, with a much higher voice like this. And then in Clute, you literally found your voice, and it's the voice that we hear today.
I feel physically, that's what's different. I mean, I feel, my body feels. I enjoy making love with him.
It's the Jane Fonda voice, the real voice.
It's very common for women. It starts in puberty when they try to be popular and fit in, and they tend to sort of bifurcate, and their real self moves outside because, God forbid, you know, all the things that are interesting about us, the anger, the complexities, the things you think men won't like. I wanted to please men at all costs. And so your voice isn't reflecting who you really are. It goes very high in your head. This is very common. Carol Gilligan, the feminist psychologist, writes a lot about it, called In a Different Voice is her famous book. And as I started to move back into my own skin, my voice dropped.
Was that, what was the experience of Clute like for you?
A complete joy. I loved Alan Bakula so much. It was like dancing a great waltz with a perfect partner. We were just completely in sync. And I tapped into something very deep, and it was wonderful.
There's the famous story about you spending a lot of time with prostitutes and madams to get to know. What did you learn about those women when you met with them?
Well, I mean, I went with them when they bought their cocaine, and it was cut in front of them, and I watched, and I went to after-hours clubs. I mean, I really hung out I saw a lot, and all the women that I met seemed so broken, kind of irreparably broken. And that, combined with the fact that even in the after-hours club, when they would hook up with their pimps, not one pimp even winked at me.
You looked very different. You were not,
I had the
had
clout.
lost the big blonde hair.
Nobody knew who I was.
Yeah.
Nobody solicited me. And I just thought, I can't do this. I can't really do justice to who this person is supposed to be. And I asked to meet with Alan, and I said, Alan, I can't do it. I think you let me out of my contract, hire Faye Dunaway.
And he said no.
And he just laughed me out of the room. He told that story a lot. He thought it was very funny.
When did you fall in love with your co-star in the third act of this documentary, Tom Hayden, and what did he change in your life?
It's going to be hard for people to understand this, but I knew about Tom Hayden. I had read some of his books. People who knew me always said, you should meet Tom Hayden. One of the things that I loved about he was brilliant. He was a movement star. He came over to my house. We had met briefly. He came over to my house, and he had a slideshow that he had put together that he wanted to show me, and he projected it on the wall of my living room about Vietnam, and it included the Pentagon Papers, which had just recently been released. And it was so profound, it reflected such sensitivity and intelligence and feeling about. See, everybody up until then had focused on what we were doing to the Vietnamese and to the ground in Vietnam, to the country. This slideshow focused on who they were. Who were these people that we were pounding into almost annihilation? Who were they as people, as a culture? Why are they resisting? And then he talked about what a whole series of administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, had known, which is we can't win. And by the time it was over, I was in love with him. I said to my roommate, I'm going to marry this guy.
And you did?
I did, yeah. And I miss him. I was with him when he died. And, he made it hard to love him as a husband. He wasn't easy, which he says. He says things in the
He's interviewed in the documentary
that I never heard him say, and that I never thought I would live long enough to hear him say.
Like what?
Well, first of all, that he was a womanizer and an alcoholic.
Yeah.
And then that because I went to Vietnam and exposed the bombing of the dikes, the bombing stopped. And I didn't think he would ever say that publicly. You know something, it's interesting. I find a lot of my choices now in what I do are in honor of him. Like I'm spending a lot of time in Michigan. He came from Royal Oak, Michigan. He was the editor of the Michigan Daily, and I spend a lot of time there. He discovered Homeboy Industries here for me, and now I'm on the board of Homeboy Industries. He's very present in my heart.
Still a big
His
part of
widow,
your life.
Barbara, and his son, Liam, their son, are family. They're part of the family. I love them so much.
Why did it not work out? Because of the womanizing and alcoholism?
Yeah, and I just didn't know how to handle it. And when he met me, I wasn't working very much. I wasn't blacklisted, but kind of grayish listed. And so he met a woman who was in transition, who was not away a lot.
Right.
I was with him. I mean, we were And we were a great partnership for a long time. And then I started getting more work, winning a second Oscar with Coming Home, started the workout to fund the organization that we started, but still he hated it because he saw it as a vanity project. And we just grew apart.
Like you say, the Jane Fonda workout really started to fund the organization and do good work, and then it became this thing.
A huge thing, yeah.
Huge thing.
And it just made him feel lonely, I think. And he, because he was lonely, he fell in love with somebody else. And I'm glad he did, because it gave me an excuse to leave. I wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
It is always, as a man, it's embarrassing to talk about this, but men just have a problem when the woman in their life is more successful or a bigger star or gets more attention.
Some men, not all men. But most men, the sense of masculinity of being a man depends so much on being the breadwinner. Mm-hmm. That when a woman is bringing in more money and is a little more successful, it's very hard on them. I mean, Tom had written scores of books before he married me. I wrote the workout book, and it became #1 on the New York Times for 2 years. That's when they started doing the how-to. You know, they divided them into categories. Yeah. So never again would the workout be #1 instead of Philip Roth. Or anyway, it was hard on Tom.
For a generation, the movies, though, that you made while you were with Tom, there was the workout video, and then you mentioned Coming Home, the China Syndrome.
9 to 5.
9 to 5. And these were all...
On Golden Pond.
On Golden Pond. Mm-hmm. These were all important movies. You really found the kind of movies that you wanted to make that really said something. 9 to 5, people often don't think about that as the original Me Too movie. It was about women in the workplace, and it took on real issues from, you say in the documentary, you know, flex hours, childcare. All of those things are wrapped up in that. I think people are very excited about a potential 9 to 5 reboot.
Hope. You never know. It's being written.
Good.
But you just never know if it's going to actually work out, but we hope so.
And what do you think is different? What are the issues that you will take on now?
Yeah, well, it's very different. And I wish I could say it's better, but it's not.
Right.
You know, back in the day when we made 9 to 5, Consolidated was the name of the company, and you were hired by Consolidated. Nowadays, you are contracted by another company that subcontracts you out to Consolidated. So if you are sexually assaulted, if you have wage theft, if you are whatever, fired because you're pregnant, who do you go to? There's forced arbitration, non-disclosure clauses. It's, you know, plus now that it's all digital online, people can spy on you, and it's really bad. It's really bad, and we want to expose that.
I was an irrelevant, apathetic movie star, married and living in France, and totally unaware of what the role of our country was in Indochina and in the rest of the world. And it was the mass movement that existed at that time in the United States that forced me to begin just to think.
It's also been very touching to me that your awareness and your original anti-war efforts were because of the GIs. And those were the same people that got so angry with you, some angry to this day. There's a lot to be proud of there. There are a lot of things you have apologized for. When you look back on that now, what are you most sorry for, but what are you most proud of?
What I'm most sorry for is that I sat on an anti-aircraft gun and had my picture taken. I didn't know that there were cameramen there, but the minute I sat down, all the flashes, and it was like, oh my God. And it's hard to even explain how it happened. I was kind of out of my mind when I look at myself in those images. Big mistake is that I went by myself.
Right.
I should not have done that. I'm too impulsive. I never would have gone to that military site. When they proposed, well, I was still here in this country, and they proposed the Vietnamese, the committee that would receive American guests, and Americans were going back and forth all the time, all kinds of Americans. They proposed visiting a military site, and I said, no, I have no interest. And yet when it came time at the very end, I was like a limp noodle. I had experienced so much that I went. And you know, if I'd had a more reasonable person with me, would say, no, you're not going. It changed me profoundly, that trip. And it's not that I'm glad that I helped end the bombing of the dikes, but I'm grateful that I went, because it taught me so much about what really is strength. You know, we're supposedly this big superpower, but we couldn't win. We were on the wrong side of history, as McNamara realized before he died. And learning about what is strength, really. I'm 80 years old. Half of my joints are replaced. I won't live that much longer, but I'm really strong now. When I was at the height of my career, I wasn't.
Right.
You know, it's just a different way of looking at what is strength. That was very, very important to me.
When did you get over the eating disorders?
There was a point in my mid-40s when I realized that that if I continued to be controlled by these addictions, that I was going to, I don't know if I was going to die, but my life would fall apart. Because as you get older, with each binge, the fatigue and the hostility and the self-loathing lasts longer. And I had a husband and children and a career, and I was politically active, and I couldn't keep doing it all and allow this addiction to rule my life. And so I stopped cold turkey. Oh, it was so hard. It was so hard.
That's really amazing to me, because we also, it was something that didn't, you have said before, you thought it was you and your friend from school and the Romans, and you're the only people that knew about it.
I didn't know that it had a name.
It wasn't talked about.
No, nobody had heard the word bulimia.
Yeah.
It was very, very difficult. And what the workout, because I was doing the workout before I started the business, it gave me back a sense of control over my body. And so that, you know, the longer time you put between yourself and the addiction, the easier it gets. And so I put a few years in between me and my last bout of eating disorders, and then I started the workout, and that kind of cemented my ability to eat normally, which I can do now. Some people say you can never get over it. You can.
What advice do you give people who are going through it and need to stop? What do you say to them?
Well, I think now there are programs and 12-step programs, and you know, I think it's important to understand that it has nothing to do with food. It has to do with filling a hole. You know, we're vessels that need to be full, and you can be full of spirit, and I don't necessarily mean that in the purely religious sense, but you know, there's something that can happen to you when you are no longer an addict, where you're connected, where you're full of spirit instead of spirits, as in alcohol or food or shopping or sex or whatever. And so just understand that it's the eating is you're trying to fill a hole that you can't fill that way. You just can't.
And there are other ways to fill it.
There are other ways to fill it. And you know, until I realized that, I didn't understand the third step of the 12 steps in AA, a higher power. And then suddenly it all became very clear to me. Because as long as you're an addict, you can't open yourself. It takes humility. And you can't do that if you're an addict. You don't, there's this hard, dark, empty place in you when you're an addict. And opening that up takes a sea change, really a transformation in your psyche that can happen in AA and in other settings. But you need help, you do.
The fourth act in the documentary is Ted Turner. You talk about why the marriage ultimately ended, but you also say this one thing that I was always curious about, which was you said there was a voice, the loudest voice, the louder voice, saying, it would be so easy to just stay, because he was a nice man.
He was handsome, he was sexy,
handsome.
He's brilliant. He had 2 million acres by the time I left of the most gorgeous land. And, you know, lighten up, Fonda, come on, get a sense of humor.
Never have to worry about certain things
Never
again.
have to work again.
Yeah.
Would have been easy, yeah. But then there was the other angel on the other shoulder, kind of a double Virginia Woolf saying, and it was hard to even hear her voice. But if you stay, you will die without ever becoming who you can be. You will not really be authentic.
Do you think that you have achieved that now?
I'm still a work in progress, but I'm trying.
Paula Weinstein, your friend,
Yeah.
is interviewed in the documentary, who knows you probably as well as anyone. She said something really interesting, that the insecurities that you dealt with as a little girl really haven't gone away. But you are, not all of them, but you are aware of them and brave enough to kind of make peace with them or accept them. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah. You can't banish the demons.
Right.
They're still there, but you learn to put them in their corner and not let their voices be the governing voices in your head. You just learn to manage them, you know, the way there's certain cancers that are in your body and they'll never go away, but you just have to manage them. And I've learned to manage my demons pretty much. You know, you're only as happy as your least happy child. So when there's something wrong with one of my kids, it kind of sends me into a loop, but it doesn't last, so.
Tell me about your relationship with your kids. You've talked a lot about, with Vanessa, you were not present as a mom. We talked about how you set about forgiving your father, but how did you set about making sure that Vanessa forgave you?
Well, when I realized the importance of understanding who my parents really were, so that I could forgive myself and understand that it wasn't my fault if they didn't love me entirely. That's when I wrote my memoir. I was really writing it for my kids, but especially for my daughter. I don't think that she's able to read it now yet in a way that can be really helpful for her. Like when I first read my father's autobiography, which he didn't write. He was a wonderful writer. I wish he had written it himself. But, you know, I got a lot more out of it after he passed, and I was ready to write my memoirs, and then I went back and read it again, and I saw so many things that I had missed. I understood so many things that I hadn't understood. And I think when I go, my daughter will be able to read my memoir and understand more.
There's a series of questions that I have here as we wrap it up. We call this the Kegel exercise. And you just fill in the blank. Then you can take a pass on any of these.
All right.
That you want. Close friends describe me as?
Brave.
Strangers describe me as?
A role model.
Only I know that I am.
A work in progress.
The movie I've seen the most times is.
Oh. Love, Actually.
Oh, that's a good one, right?
Yeah.
I think that might be mine as well, because it's at least once a year.
Yeah.
I start every day by doing.
Taking my dog out.
A lot of people love it, but I think blank is totally overrated.
Reality TV.
I think I'm really good at.
Forgiving.
I think I'm really bad at.
Being cynical.
The best advice I ever received is.
Never go into a business you don't understand.
My greatest extravagance is.
Books.
The thing about myself I've learned to love is.
My resilience.
The teacher I'm most grateful for is.
Katharine Hepburn.
Did you spend a lot of time with her other than on Golden Pond ever?
Mm-mm.
What did she teach you?
The importance of how you present to the world, which I had never thought about, and it made her very angry that I hadn't thought about it. I always thought that self-consciousness was pejorative, but especially if you're an actor and a public figure, how you present, which is more than just how you look, is very important. She taught me that. She taught me the importance of facing your fears. Otherwise, you'll get soggy.
Soggy.
Yes. She taught me that guys like Spencer Tracy and my father don't necessarily realize when they hurt you. She made it a point to teach me a lot, and I think she did it so that after she died, I'd keep talking about her.
That's probably true.
You know, after she won her 4th Academy Award, and I did not win my 3rd, I called her up to congratulate her, and her first words to me were, "You'll never catch me now."
Not at all competitive. No. The salt of the earth. That's funny. It's interesting because she was so not known for fashion or all of those things, but that idea that she really thought image was important. And if you think about her life, it was all about that image.
And she always had the same image. Yeah. And one of her fixations was never being shorter than the people she was with. When I did my first scene on Golden Pond, when I show up and I had high heels on, she cut and then she disappeared for about 10 minutes. And when she came back, she had heels on.
I love the smell of
men who wear musky cologne.
I could talk about blank for hours on end.
How different the development of boys is from the development of girls.
I can sum up my life in this bumper sticker.
I pass. Never give up.
Never give up.
Never give up.
Thank you, Jane Fonda.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time today.